I've been gone for a while. And, a lot of that is for personal reasons. Stuff I don't really feel comfortable with sharing, necessarily. Because as you guys know, I'm not really that much of a personal person anyway. So
I was talking to nobody. I was still announcing things.
I was too deep in the film stage, but not deep enough to actually really understand.
Anyways, hi. The last time that I did a video essay was in February of 2021. And as a sort of comeback to longer form discussions, I wanted to kind of make this a little bit of a bigger deal. Because, what's the point of making art if you're not injecting at least a little bit of the artist into the work, right? Or I guess in my case, a lot of the artists.
It all started when I was 5 years old.
And so, in honor of my glorious return to content, I figured that it would be cool if we talked a little bit about the narrative return. And I'm not just talking about the diegetic return, something just regarding the story itself, but moreover, the non-diegetic return. A return from our world to a story thought to be complete. This is going to be a little embarrassing for me to admit, but I haven't recreationally read a book in years. College was a long time ago, and, other than that, even before that, I wasn't really much of a fiction reader, There was probably something here or there, but altogether nothing substantial, so. I haven't been an avid reader since I was in middle school. Every other weekend I'd be at the library. But you know what? I haven't been to a library since then, and gotta be honest with you, I am not planning on going back.
Be quiet.
Rest assured, I have been preparing for my return to reading by structuring the whole introduction of this video in a space that facilitates me reading the script. You could probably tell I was doing that and thought, wow, he's clearly reading the script. Yes, ma'am. Good eye. Now read my lips. However, I'm happy to announce that this portion of the video requires no live reading since I can't be loud or conspicuous while I'm recording in this library. I have once again avoided doing a lot of work in the same way that I did in certain other essays I've done recently. Now, where is it? The late Gary Paulsen has a pretty massive body of work, a good chunk of which has to do with narratives about wilderness survival, or at the very least heavily feature the woods as a central setting. This tracks. The man was a hunter and a trapper, a dog sledder, and admittedly a pretty vocal critic of technology. He is recorded to have abandoned guns in favor of handmade bows and arrows. Now, most anti-tech people I would give a hard time for that, but honestly, that's kinda sick. The most famous of Paulsen's works was Hatchet, a story of a preteen boy named Brian Robeson who, after the single-engine plane he was the sole passenger of crashes in the Canadian wilderness, must survive until he's found. He teaches himself how to catch and cook food, avoid natural dangers, and ultimately comes of age in the isolation of the deep woods. Now, I'm actually less interested in talking to you about Hatchet, as it's already considered by many to be Paulsen's magnum opus and has garnered so much praise, awards, reprints, and analysis by people that critique literacy for a living that retreading on that would feel a little redundant. I'd rather reduce the amount I can embarrass myself while I'm... You get it. No, what I want to focus on instead are what came after Hatchet. A return all its own, as Gary Paulsen would come back again and again to the story thought to be concluded when Brian Robeson was finally saved after 54 days of life in the wilderness. 4 times after Hatchet, we would return to the woods. Each of these stories would represent a different kind of return, of Brian, of Paulsen himself, and of the reader, not only to locations of familiarity, but to themes of that same nature. Meet me in the woods.
Shh, I said shh already.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, you need to get out of here. Yeah, go. Get you read something your age level. Stop reading children's books.
How long, baby, have I been away? Oh, it feels like ages, though you say it's only days.
I'm not exactly interested in going over the details of the story event for event, because, in all honesty, you could probably blow through all 5 of them in like 2 days.
Yeah, the truth is stranger than all my dreams.
What do you want with me? Derek smiled. You can probably guess. Brian shook his head. Well, to make it short, we want you to do it again.
54 days after being isolated with nothing but a windbreaker and a belt-looped hatchet, Brian was finally rescued and returned to his life. Although, as expected, even a little under 2 months of such a drastic change in environment itself changed Brian fundamentally.
From the epilogue to Hatchet.
Many of the changes would prove to be permanent. Brian had gained immensely in his ability to observe what was happening and react to it. That would last him all his life. He had become more thoughtful as well, and from that time on, he would think slowly about something before speaking. He had many dreams about the lake after he was rescued. They were not nightmares, none of them were frightening, but he would awaken at times with them. Just awaken and sit up and think of the lake, the forest, the fire at night, the night birds singing, the fish jumping. Sit in the dark alone and think of them, and it was not bad and would never be bad for him.
I bring this up because it was obviously never publicly set in stone that Gary Paulsen would continue this story. He had always known he would, as he would later admit. But as far as readers in 1987 knew, this would likely be the last time they saw Brian Robeson. And so, when 4 years later The River was released, readers would find themselves returning to their school libraries and book order pamphlets, ultimately returning to Paulsen, who was in turn returning to Brian, who was in turn returning to... Derek Holzer is a government psychologist who finds himself at the front door of Brian Robeson, a now teenager who has been out of the woods and back in civilization for 2 years. He's looking to convince Brian to take him back into the wild to help him and his trainees learn the survival skills that kept him alive for those 54 days.
Derek is the vehicle for the series' first diegetic return, a character that exists solely just to get Brian back into the woods. Now, it could be argued that Derek isn't really necessary to the story itself, but I think it could also be argued that without Derek, there kinda is no story.
And Brian boards this vehicle, more literally so in the form of the makeshift raft he constructed once the story takes a turn and Derek is nearly killed on their little camping trip. Once again, we are thrust into a story that makes us feel how we did with Brian initially, in Hatchet. We must once again live in these woods. We must once again survive. We must adapt and learn all again. We must return.
My absolute favorite part about The River is not necessarily in its details, although those are in and of themselves spectacular. Now, my favorite part is about how it ends. And I'm not talking about the regular ending, I'm actually more referring to the epilogue, which Paulsen entitles Measurements.
He goes over all of the interesting facts about the distance Brian traveled on the river, indulges us on the fate of Derek, and leaves us on a note that I feel is essential to begin to understand why all of this matters so much to me as an artist. About 7 months after the events of the main story, Brian receives a package. It's from Derek. The delivery drivers unload a massive canoe, with the words "The Raft" etched on either side of it. Taped to the inside of the canoe is a note from Derek.
Next time, it won't be so hard to paddle. Thanks.
It is so odd to me that I have such contempt for tentpole films, big studio blockbusters that focus, primarily on sequels and remakes and other such things outside of what most might consider to be an enclosed story. And yet, there's something genuinely earnest to me about the way in which Gary Paulsen establishes a series, Much like the very end of the first chapter, the epilogue calls on Brian and also us to consider returning.
Except we don't return. I mean, not the way we expect. Not yet, anyway. I'm sorry, can we talk about this? It seriously didn't snow once this year enough to justify going out and filming in the actual snow. You're telling me that the fossil fuel industry is directly responsible for the fact that this video is slightly more shitty? Aren't you? You're the librarian. Wait, you're the librarian. Why are you in this part of the video?
You don't ask me. I don't know.
Everything in nature means something, and he had missed the warnings that summer was ending, had in many ways already ended, and what was coming would be the most dangerous thing he had faced since the plane crash.
As of 1996, we did not get a next time, as we were promised at the end of the river. Instead of forward, the next chapter in a linear story, we instead returned to the end of the first one. Brian's Winter, now an official retcon sequel to Hatchet, but treated at the time as a sort of what-if story, extends Brian Robeson's 54 days in the wilderness to an ultimately unspecified longer stretch. All we do know is that he spends another 35 days finishing out the summer, then the entirety of the fall, and finally... So it is here that we experience a new kind of return. While The River encouraged readers to only come back to the themes and lessons learned previously as an opportunity to look forward, to create new stories with the previous ones on our shoulders, Brian's Winter reassures us that we are equally as validated in our nostalgia, our curiosity to return to the stories we know. Readers were apparently not finished with Hatchet, the first book, and made that abundantly clear in the countless correspondences toward Paulsen himself.
I get maybe between 300 and 400 letters a day, fan letters. Just overwhelming, and I answer them. Mm-hmm. But constantly, they want more Hatchet. They want more Brian. They want more Brian. So they finally they would demand what would happen had he not gotten out? How could he survive the winter? So I wrote Brian's Winter as an answer to those fans. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of letters now. I mean, it's not just a few. This is every 3 days is over 1,000 letters.
And so it's established that Paulsen was not the only one who could will the people he's connected with to meaningfully revisit a work of art. The young people he inspired, excited and invested, persuaded him to take another look at his original magnum opus, in an attempt to find more after its last page. More wood survival skills, more heart-pounding instances of mortal danger, more heart-stopping descriptions of the beauty of nature, and more from the perspective of Brian Robeson. I once again cannot stress enough the subtle difference between young readers convincing an artist to revisit a completed work as a sort of collaboration between artist, art, and art lover, and the modern push from adult consumers of studio IP strong-arming underpaid artists to change something they're already overworked for, or just to make more of the same thing. Actually, it's not that subtle when you put it like that, is it? Brian's Winter ends as Hatchet did. Brian is rescued and is taken home, albeit with modified circumstances that fit his extended time in the bush. In the dead of winter, he stumbles across a Cree trapping camp and befriends the Smallhorns, a family who he would stay with for his final 3 weeks before a supply plane would arrive to save him. From the final page of Brian's Winter.
By the 3rd week, when he watched the bush planes circle and land on the lake ice on skis, the truth was, he almost didn't want to leave. The woods had become so much a part of his life. The heat of it seemed to match his pulse, his breathing, that as he helped the Smallhorns and pilot unload, he felt as if he were unloading gear and food for himself as well as the family, as though he would be staying to watch the plane leave. David knew Brian enough to know why he hesitated. He left the pile of supplies and came forward and smiled and waved an arm around a country, all the country all the woods and lake and sky and all that was in it. He knew, and he touched Brian on the shoulder and said, "It'll be here when you get back. We'll keep the soup hot." And Brian turned and stepped into the plane.
And a thing happens where you have trouble being with people. It's not that you dislike people, it's just that it's close.
Oh.
Cities are too close and towns are too close. And I have to go back. Yeah. And so I examined Brian and put him in the same situation. And he goes back.
It was a dream of getting ready.
Always that. Getting ready.
Ready to go back.
Ready to go home.
Brian's return is the reason why this essay exists. It's my favorite book of the series, and as an added stone on the thematic pile, it's the book that I find myself constantly returning to, over and over again, despite not having picked up a book in a long time. In a way, David Smallhorn's "It Will Be Here When You Get Back" could have referred to the events of the river, but the ending of the river, the final words in the contents of Derek's gifted note to Brian, specify a nebulous next time we had yet to see. In a way, the other supplemental works to Hatchet, the light sequel, and the What If story were less of a return in the case of character or theme, and more of a real-life return, for us, for the author. All those letters that fans sent Paulsen over the years encouraged him to return, if only briefly, to embellish. And so, the new stories we got were more of the same, but with a different coat of paint. Survival but in the winter, and survival but on the water. This is not a criticism of the Hatchet series. It's just my way of trying to tell you that this return that we had come to expect was mainly just to a place of general familiarity. The themes of Brian's winter are identical to Hatchet's because they are just two halves of one story, and the themes of the river are in that story's same vein. The retreading was intentional. We were not returning to learn, we were returning to be together, to be back with Brian in the woods. Brian's return is not about survival, and we would not be returning to something familiar. But Brian would, and so we would join him. Gary Paulsen said of Brian's return in his introduction to its official teacher's guide in 1998,
"This last book perhaps shows Brian most completely, most truly, how he has changed mentally, how he deals with home life, and finally, how he must return to the woods that made him whole."
We were familiar with none of this. Everything about Brian's home life was extremely vague in every book leading up to this. Even Hatchet, which shined a light on the divorce and adultery between Brian's parents, never placed the reader in those spaces, only in Brian's mind as he recalled them, alone in the woods. His mental change was only ever slightly touched upon in epilogues and afterwards, never harped on or highlighted beyond the point of wrapping up a story by noting Brian's progress. I did lie just now. We weren't familiar with none of this. As a matter of fact, I think there was one thing that, even unbeknownst to Paulsen himself, he had gotten his readers to begin doing, so that with each subsequent installment, we would be kind of prepared and primed to do one thing in particular.
Return! It was return. I just figured I've been saying return like at least 30 times throughout this entire essay that we'd all kind of figured that the answer was, it doesn't really matter, repetition. It's repetition. Speaking of, it was the repetition of Paulsen's beckoning to his young readers to pick up another book in his series that made Brian's return so special. Because a lot was different in this story than the last ones. As a matter of fact, Brian does not return to the wilderness until the book's 8th chapter. Out of 18.
Instead, we spend time with Brian at school, at home, in counseling, getting into a fight, buying gear from catalogs, and lying under the stars in his backyard. Brian is, for the first time, the audience surrogate. Like us, he yearned to go back to the familiar. But instead of dropping us in the familiar, Gary Paulsen brings Brian to our level and treats our anticipation, our yearning, our impatience with empathy.
We were never meant to want to be like Brian, to escape, to abandon our lives. Brian was meant to be like us, to dream, to find what he was looking for, to feel frustration and otherness in a world that he didn't squarely fit in. He would find that the lessons that he learned in the bush ran counter to the real world, got him in trouble. Without understanding who we felt we were as readers, from the summer to the winter to the river, We would never truly feel the impact of reflecting on all of this as Brian is finally allowed to do. He comes to a decision. He must return. Paulsen writes in the author's note for Brian's return.
Once I knew the truth of the woods, which came to me about the time I wrote Hatchet, once I knew what happened, I knew I would write this book, in a way before I wrote Hatchet or The River or Brian's Winter. Once you've seen the horizon, have followed it, have lived with nature in all its vicious beauty, it is impossible to come back to normal life. Like Brian, I tried. I bought a house in town with a yard and neighbors because I thought that was the thing to do, and inside a week I was pacing like a panther in a cage, trying to see out, see across the town to the trees, to the woods. I simply could not do it. I went back to a hut in the mountains of New Mexico, and though it was a small version of the bush, I could see the trees and the sky and the horizon, and for a time it kept me from going insane. When I developed heart disease after running those 2 Iditarods, I had to give up my sled dogs and could not live in northern winters, and that denied the wild to me. I could not go back to the bush as Brian does in this book, though I tried several times. And I'm not certain what would have become of me had I not rediscovered the sea.
I think that I have spent my whole life returning. That takes all kinds of forms. Sometimes it's nostalgia, other times rekindled interests, and sometimes it's just coming back to something you weren't ready for before. I think a lot of life is just picking up where you left off. I've been gone. Not because I was busy, but because things were changing. And this isn't the first time I've taken a long break from my work, and it won't be the last time either. There's nothing truly special about this time in particular, except for the fact that it happened to align with my return to Gary Paulsen's flagship children's series. I don't know. It got me thinking about why I was gone, why I wasn't feeling creative or particularly useful in any artistic space. I wasn't radio silent either, but the things I would make would serve as more of a holdover, a promise that I was still around. I wasn't back. This is the dramatic bit where I look stoically into camera and say, I'm back now. But I'm never sure. Maybe like Gary Paulsen, I'll be determined to return again and again, to keep trying, but ultimately, I'll have to settle. There was one more book in the Hatchet series, and it was Brian's Hunt, which surprised readers because in 1999, Paulsen insisted that Return was going to be the last book of the series. Hunt was another great entry, with new thematic focuses and even some unexpected and shocking subject matter, but it does little to lend to our talk outside of one moment, a final non-diegetic word from Paulsen after the tale itself had concluded.
I can almost hear the voices. You said the last Brian book was the last Brian book, and I did say that, but the response from readers is still profoundly overwhelming. Hundreds of letters a day, all wanting more of Brian. And so this book. And I will no longer say that I will write no more about Brian and the Northwoods. In some way, he has become real to many, many people. And they want to see more of him. And so, we shall see.
Brian's Hunt is officially 20 years old. And as of October 2021, Gary Paulsen has no longer been with us. This is the last book in the series. And yet, between its release and the announcement of the series creator's death, I had never lost hope that there could be more to it. But this was it. I always saw Paulsen's last words on that subject, in that afterword for Brian's Hunt, as a reassurance to children that, while nothing is set in stone, nothing is also impossible. There's always the opportunity to return, and even if it never ends up happening, if we stay hoping for the worlds we know to make their way back to us, or us to them, I think we come to find that the hope is what keeps us here. So no, this won't be my last video. In case you thought it might be. Now, whether it's my last good video, that remains to be seen, but I guess we shall see. And so I am writing this on a laptop while seagulls fight over garbage up in the dumpster at the top of the public docks. There is a soft rain coming down. I can hear it pattering on the skylight hatch over my head, and I have Mozart on the tape player while I wait. Not long, just until the wind changes. And then I will go again, always, as Brian must always go.
I've seen what the darkness does. Take it